All right, David, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. My name is David Ramos. I've been building the New York Harbor Railroad since 2009, 2008. We started working on it. Interesting thing is, if you see the logo on the screen, a true story. I'm on eBay one day and I'm looking through, and this logo is for sale. It's my logo. I created it in Photoshop, so you never know who's going to see your artwork. So make sure you keep track of what's out there. So we're selling for $5 a pop. I didn't get a dime of it, but one of my friends actually got upset about it and he had it taken down. But welcome to the New York Harbor Railroad. I'm going to talk about some of the things I've done over the past few years working on her. Um, the railroad itself was designed and built to operate, and one of the side effects of the way it was built, it has what we call variable crewing. So I don't need to have a full crew of 15. I could run with as little as two, as many as 15, and you'll see in a little bit how many, what the breakdown is on it. The layout itself is about 15 years old and it operates the first of the month. There's some technological challenges and changes that I have done over the past couple of years. The pandemic was actually good and bad for me for working on the layout. One of the wonderful issues was I was able to redo a lot of things I've wanted to do. One of the negatives that came out is that people got out of habit of coming to the layout, and that's true with a lot of the layouts in New Jersey. People have not returned back to operating as vigorously as we were before. I used to be able to sell out the sessions on the first day I sent out the notice. Now it's a few days and all that. But being that I don't require 30, 40, or 10, 12 people to come, I could operate as little as two. It actually works into my advantage. Doesn't make a difference how few or how many people I get. Uh, there's some turnout upgrades that we've done, and we have some more advancements and enhancements in the horizon that's coming down on the layout. Some milestones that we reached. Construction has began in actually February 2006. It was actually, I used to work on another gentleman's layout here in New Jersey, and I got really tired of working in 1892, and I decided I was going to build my dream layout, which was going to be the New York Harbor area. And I started working on it in 2006. And our first session was February 2008. So in a little bit over under 2 years, actually, it was 2 years in a day. We went from going to Home Depot, buying lumber, to actually having roadbed and track to work with. And it was actually quite exciting back then because I would literally spend the night laying track. And I don't know if you remember, 2008 was a very interesting season for the New York Mets. I would literally have the TV on and I'd be listening to them play, and I'd say, well, when the game's over, I'll call it a night. Little did I know that that was going to be the year that we're going to have several dozen extra inning games. So I spent a lot of nights working on the layout and getting a lot of track work done. I hosted a pro rail in April 2013. And like I said, our regular operating sessions are the first Saturday of every month. We usually operate at 11 o'clock and we run for about 3 to 4 hours. We run on a DCC platform of NCE. It's a Powerhouse Pro. It's a single 5 amp system. You have Wi-Fi, Y throttles via JMRI. We also have a plethora of Tam Valley frog juicers. There's some spots where the prototype used hand throws, so I used hand throws, and that was actually made life a lot easier. And here's where I was talking about the crew options and the crew sizings. The railroad itself is 4 separate independent layouts, if you want to think of it in that manner. There's the 30th Street Yard, which can have a crew as little as 3, as many as 4. We've actually had as many as 5 on that. It's a little overkill with 5, but 3 to 4 is usually works, with one person being the yard master. You have an east and west crew, and then you also have a crew member who brings the trains in from staging and brings them back into staging. That person also handles terminal stores. Terminal stores is an interesting building because it actually is a point in the railroad where all of the physical railroads interact. So the New York Central, the Lehigh Valley, and Erie all manage and work freight into that one building. The Erie Railroad's 28th Street has a crew of 2. We used to have a crew of 3, but it's down to 2 because I pre-stage everything before the session. And then the Lehigh Valley's 27th Street. These are all car float yards, and the only street running that they do is inside the yard and running into terminal stores. So here is a look at where the area is. This is from 1928. It's from a newspaper, and you can see all the buildings in there. And we know it's before 1930 because down at the bottom right, you'll see a white building with the bottom arrow that points to the Baltimore and Ohio. And then there's a yard that's just north of that, and that's the Lehigh Valley. In 1931, the Lehigh Valley built the Lehigh Sterrett building, or the Sterrett Lehigh building. It was built the same year as the Empire State Building, and it was also completed in just a little bit over a calendar year. The brick building in the middle there, just above that, is Terminal Stores. That's the one I was talking about. And then the Erie, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania. So in literally a 10-block range, you have 5 railroads, and you also have all these car floats and all these docks and all this river traffic. And today it's all gone. There's still some buildings that are still there, but I'm going to show you a little bit through this, how you can see the progression of the city there. So this is, again, 1928. This picture was from an insurance company. DLNW Pier is the pier that's in front of 28th Street, and that is 28th Street, which is right next to Terminal Stores. Let me see if I could use the little finger here. There it goes. So this is Terminal Stores. I hope you guys can see that. This is Lehigh Valley. That's the Erie. This is the Johnson Soap Works. This is the New York Central, and way over here is the Pennsylvania. This photograph is a high-resolution photograph that I found, and it was taken specifically because of the pier fire. So this pier was burnt down, and I got lucky because it shows the railroad and the layout before the building of the elevated or the High Line. This entire branch of the New York Central was called the 30th Street branch, and then it was modernized in the 30s with the elevated division, and then they had the street running division. And if you go there today, it looks totally different than that. All these yards are gone, with the exception of the yard where the New York Central has. That's now the Long Island Railroad passenger terminal. That's where they lay the trains over before they used to go back to Long Island. Here is a similar photo from the air. This is a from historic aerials. And here in 1954, you could see the B&O. You can see the Lehigh Sterrett, which is now enclosed. It's no longer just a open yard. Is the Erie. Here is that one block. Remember, there was only one building here. This is John T. Stanley Soap Works. This is the elevated branch, and this is 30th Street Yard. And this is a real interesting site if you're ever looking for photographs. It's historical aerials. I purchased this one for about 20 bucks. It's a super high res. I could actually zoom in. What's really cool here, remember the pier that had burnt is gone. It was right over here. It's completely gone. This is the DL&W pier. This was mostly brought in, used for bringing in what's called a Broadway car float, which is basically a 2-track car float with a ramp going down the middle of it. For the primary use of this was to bring over fruits, vegetables, things that were sold at auction. They would unload it here at the pier, and this would be brought out into the trucks. This is West Street or 12th Avenue now, and this is the car float going to the this is going to the Lehigh Sterrett, and the car float going to the Erie is right here. There's no car float in there right now, and then this is the car float going into the B&O Railroad. So come to think of everything, the New York Central was an add-on to the layout. The New York Central originally, my original plan was to build the Erie, the Lehigh Valley, and the B&O, And I have a friend of mine by the name of Jay Held who basically said, hey, you have all this extra room. You're going to build a mock yard for terminal stores to have the New York Central come and interchange and to work with the other yards. Why don't you just use the space and build the New York Central? And we started doing that, and then we added the elevated line mostly because it was going to be a scenic element. Then we actually got it built and working, and it adds a lot of an interesting dynamic to the layout, mostly because it is the only portion of the layout where the crews walk with the trains. If you want to think of it this way, 30th Street, 27th Street, and 28th Street, the train comes to you. 28th and 27th, it's a car float, and for the 30th Street, it's going roughly 15 to 20 feet from staging into the yard, and then you work the train that way. So it's the elevated branch is the only one that people actually walk around with their trains, and they work the industries that are on the elevated. And this is all dark territory. It's all yard limit. All the trains at this point were radio equipped, so they would talk to each other and they would work these industries one at a time. And it's quite interesting. Everybody gets into it, and we've had a lot of fun with it. So let's start at the north. This is 72nd Street Yard, 79th Street Yard. Right at this point, they're building the Miller Expressway. The West Side Highway was originally called the Miller Expressway. So this is fairly early. Underneath that structure that you see over there is a roundhouse. You can't really see it at this point. It's completely covered in. And this yard changed configuration. It changed what it actually did as the years went by. What's interesting about this is about 79th Street here. The building that you see in the corner that's there is gone. It's now part of the Trump Empire. It's one of the Trump buildings that are there. But all this is now a park. And down to the bottom right underneath that structure would be a roundhouse, and there'd be an office building. If this didn't exist, you'd see that. Missing from this is also, you'll see all the piers on the right towards the top. There was a large elevator. By the time this photograph was taken, the elevator was removed. The granite foundation for the elevator is still there. It's a grain elevator. It was instrumental for rebuilding Europe. It was used on part of the Marshall Plan. So a lot of flour and food came into this area. They were loaded onto ships and shipped out. But after this point, after that, it was pretty much no longer needed. It was torn down. You can see down in the bottom right of the photograph, those are electrics. Those are DES3s or other New York Central electrics. And what's really cool about this yard, it had a Red Devil coal loader. Precision Scale makes them. They run about $1,400. My good friend Ron Parisi was building this yard, and we were trying to figure out how they coaled the locomotives here, because this entire yard was run by steam engines. Even though the Kaufman Act was in place, it still ran into steam engine until the late 40s, and they still had to fuel these things. So we found one photograph where you could see a coal car. It looked like it was hovering in midair, and it was sitting on a ramp, and it was dropping coal into the Red Devil. And the Red Devil was on tracks, and it would literally go back and forth and load the steam engines. It was sitting to the left and to the right in parallel tracks. This is the yard that I model, but this is before the elevated here. All this trackage is gone at this point. Where you see all those boxcars on the left-hand side, that's where the Long Island Railroad is. It's pretty sad to think of what we lost in here. One of the interesting things about this yard is that main line that goes through the middle there was also a passenger line. President Lincoln's inaugural train went through this yard. President Lincoln's funeral train went through this yard to get up to Spuyten Duyvil and go back west to Illinois. So this is a lot of historic things happen in this yard. And I also want you to take a brief second to look at all the steam engines. All right, this is 1920s, mid to late 1920s. You know that because there's no elevator being built. The elevator was built in the 1930s, was finished in 1934 or 1932 actually. So in here, all these freight houses were all torn down when the elevator was built. Um, and so it's kind of an interesting look at what existed back then. And when I blew this picture up, if you look really closely in the middle of the photograph, you'll see a steam engine, you see a water tower. Behind that water tower is a small turntable to turn these locomotives. Uh, I got very lucky one year. I went to the Kingston train show, and at the Kingston train show, I came across these little maps of the New York Central, and they're black and white images, mostly black with these white lines and all that. And I was able to scan them in, and I got lucky. I bought an entire package of them for $5. The gentleman didn't know what he had. Turns out that these were all mimeograph copies. They had that smell. If you guys for a certain vintage know what I'm talking about, but it brings in uh, what I'm trying to do. So the line at the bottom is heading north towards Spuyten Duyvil and into the mainland, which is the Bronx. You'll see a Y there. That Y breaks off and goes into a meat plant, which is basically a slaughterhouse. So it's kind of hard to believe that there was a slaughterhouse in Manhattan, but there was. You'll see a number of blocks between the slaughterhouse and the New York Central yards. In this area, there was a Pennsylvania yard, and the Pennsylvania would actually walk the cows through what they call cow tunnels. So you couldn't drive cattle through the city streets. You could drive sheep and pigs because there was no ordinance in it, but there's actually a blue law in New York City that says you can't drive cattle through the streets. And it was because of this situation here that the Pennsylvania actually built tunnels that went down underneath so the cows would go down and wind up in the slaughterhouse. And the New York Central had, being one of the few railroads that had full rail access to Manhattan, would bring them in on cars, and then they'd be dispatched there, and wonderful steaks would come out of there. So just to give you an idea of what the level of this industry was here. And in this drawing here, the elevated line is in. At the end over here, you'll see an outset, which is right here. That is the post office. That's the Morgan Post Office that was built. And originally that was a milk terminal and a passenger station. And when they built the post office during with the WPA project, that was put in as part of the elevated, and it was kind of interesting to see that they would receive mail in there. And there's actually a plaque on the side of that building today acknowledging the Lincoln train. So I'm blowing this up a little bit so you can see a little bit better, but you can see the diversity of the yard. What's really interesting, in the very middle of the yard with all those tracks is an Anheuser-Busch brewery. And it was there. I have photographs of it getting cars, and I have that represented in the layout. So a lot of different traffic. This was not a classification yard. This was more or less a terminal. The classification took place at 72nd Street. Found this color postcard from 1960s. What's really cool about this is on the left-hand side, bottom left, you'll see pacemaker unit train that would come in. The pacemaker would come in every morning and leave every night. And whether it was completely loaded or not, the cars would go west, and they'd come from the east and from Boston. Also, there was two different pacemakers that came in. What's important for me on this photograph is you can see the John T. Stanley Soapworks, and you can see the roof for the Erie building on the right and the Miller Expressway. This was where they were building the heliports, and I believe that this was to showcase the heliports, and the railroad was in the background. And you can see that bridge in the back. That's how they elevated 11th Avenue to get over the railroad. And that bridge is still there. This is where they were supposed to build the new Jets and Giants Stadium, but now they're building housing and other mixed-use industry there. This is another view. This is again from the 1950s, and you can see the 11th Avenue. If you were walking there, you would have no idea you're on a bridge. The topology of Manhattan at this point is that this is a low spot, and the streets actually slope up towards Fifth Avenue. And you can see all the different type of industries that are here. And if you look in the top, and again, hopefully you guys can see the mouse, This is the Pennsylvania. This is the Pennsylvania coming in. This Pennsylvania Railroad. This is the elevated line coming in. This is the Starrett Lehigh building. Starrett Lehigh building also has one cool factor. It is the first, what they called industrial style, what we call Art Deco style building that was built in the city at that time. It and the Empire State Building, which are both Art Deco-ish, are built at that time. All these tracks go underneath 11th and head towards 72nd Street Yard. When they built the Javits Center, this is 34th Street. This is 35th Street. When they built the Javits Center, they plopped her down here. So they moved this track to here, which increased the grade, because now instead of having this nice long grade that starts here and goes up in here, the grade now starts here and has to go up a really steep incline to get to meet up with the existing High Line. And down here, again, the Stanley Soap Works, and you can see the Erie. So one of the things that intrigued me, and I've had this photograph for years and didn't even realize it, is that on all the maps that I had, this siding that you see over here where the tank car is sitting, never said it was built. It said a private siding, and it was a dotted line, and on some sites that I came across said this site, it was never actually finished. Well, it was finished. It was used. It was used by the John T. Stanley Soap Works. This is how they got all their supplies in to make soap. If you go on eBay, you'll find that they make novelty soaps and different types of soaps. They made soaps in the shapes of bears and things like that, and it was pretty cool to actually find photographs and make an image of that building. It's not an actual model; it's a Photoshop image. This is my next Photoshop image of the Weber McLaughlin Coal Company. And the other kit the other building that I'm actually working on is underneath the High Line. If you look to the right, you'll see this crane. That crane's roughly 40 feet tall, and it's to offload the material that comes in at the steel platform. So this is how they would get refrigerators in, anything in a crate would come in on those tracks. And I've seen pictures of that crane on different parts of the yard. There weren't more than one crane. It was just one crane. Somehow or another, ingenuity, a lot of sweat, and a lot of lack of OSHA, they moved that crane around the yard. So it's kind of interesting to see that. That's one of the models I'm hoping to build in the next few months or next year. I just bought a 3D printer and I'm looking to print it. There's a bunch of cranes that are very similar to that. If anybody's a BEDT fan, there's a BEDT version of that. It's a lot lighter than that. The BEDT one is, I believe, a third smaller than it. So I want to build this one because it's kind of beefy and it's kind of cool. And it was used from the 20s, from the teens to it was there, photographs into the 60s, because there's a photograph that I found of the yard in the late 60s and one in the 80s where the crane is actually still there. What they used the crane for, one of the original purposes was to do this, and you see this is from Richard Stander's collection. Those are cargo containers. Those are basically LCL containers. So before the containerization that we have today, this is one of the containerizations that they had back then. What's interesting is that this is one of the receivers that is also at St. John's Park. Is a company called Universal Receiving, and there's another one called Western Receiving, Western Car Loading. And these were handed off, lifted off of especially built gondolas and flat cars. And one of the interesting things about the gondolas is you did not need the overhead crane. What you would do is you'd be able to drive a truck up to the back, drop the hatch off, and then winch the cargo, the LCL container off. And it was really an interesting thing. Oddly enough, the Central didn't care how much you put in it, neither did the B&O, neither did the Lehigh Valley. All the companies that actually use the LCL containers didn't care what you put on it. They give you a flat rate, sort of like FedEx if it fits in a box of chips. There was a railroad in the Northeast that could not compete, so they did what they all do. They litigate, they sued, and they got this traffic stopped. And it did not come back until Ronald Reagan deregulated the railroads, and then containers came back. And that was one of the things that, as we know, helped save modern railroading. So, but this existed in the 20s, and it was litigated out of existence until like until the 80s. One of the interesting things about modeling the New York Central in the era, this era was this is a picture of 1948, and it's a FM Erie locomotive. It's number 5000, and it's pulling the pacemaker. So you get all sorts of weird stuff coming into 72nd Street. It's not your typical yard. And what's also interesting, you'll see the model version of this photograph. This is a 72nd Street yard. One of the things I want to make uh, clear about New York Central really hating modelers is that in this part of the railroad, the yard would have a name whenever you came in. So if you came south from the main yard, like Selkirk, and you entered this yard, you arrived at 79th Street yard, 72nd Street yard, wherever the yard office was. When you left south and you headed towards 30th Street, you left 60th Street yard, because that was where they handed you the paperwork. So there's a lot of confusion when I was trying to figure out what was where, because it looked like there was more than one yard. It depends on what period you're in and what area you're looking at. The yards had different names depending on where you came in, but it was all considered one yard. So we got lucky, a friend of mine and I, we got lucky. We were at a Timonium train show and we found this map, and the map is 72 by 50. And this is just a black and white photograph of it. And this is the area where I modeled. And there it is. There's the private siding that you see there. And you can see the elevated above it. One of the other things that helped design and build the layout was the fact that the Port Authority had these Port Authority maps. And there were also another one there that's called Bromley. There's a plethora of them that are out there. New York City, there are a lot of Bromley maps, and Sanborn maps also. Unfortunately, all the originals to these maps, the original set that the Port Authority had, were destroyed in 9/11 when the Port Authority's buildings were destroyed downtown. So what's out there are other collections, and they, from what I understand, they managed to rebuild from what was publicly available what they had. But here you have what I was trying to recreate. So you have the Erie, you have the Lehigh Valley on the bottom, and the Leggett building, which is actually terminal stores. It was actually built as terminal stores, and then Francis Leggett bought the building afterwards. It was a fireproof warehouse, and of course, being a fireproof warehouse, it had a fire, and they had to rebuild a good portion of it. So if you actually, the building still exists today. If you come into New York City and you look at it, you'll see a distinct portion of the building that does not look like the rest of it, and that's the portion that burnt down and it was rebuilt. It's a really cool building. Recently, they remodeled the interior of the building, and the tracks was still there. When I last saw it, the tracks were covered in concrete. I thought they were gone. A good friend of mine named Vince Lee was there, and he was actually able to confirm that the tracks were still there. I don't know if they were taken out, but there was 22 individual industries buildings in this one building. They're all fireproof, and the boxcars would be left on those two tracks. And this was not an isolated instance in New York City. This was also done by Nabisco downtown, which is now Chelsea Markets. They originally, before the elevator was built, they had two tracks that went through the middle of the building. The railroad would push those cars in, and they would be unloaded there. So I went off of this as a drawing for many years when I was designing it in 2005 and 2006, and then I got lucky and I was able to find the Holy Grail, which was a 1964 valuation map. And from that, I drew this. This is an actual track map that's used in my operating session. It lays out what's what. What's really interesting is you get tunnel vision when you do this stuff, and you forget what things were called. And so over here it says Pennsylvania Warehouse, And the Pennsylvania warehouse is actually interesting because all of a sudden later on I started finding out data about that warehouse. I'm like, where in God's name is the Pennsylvania warehouse? Even though I had it on my drawing, I had to. It took a second for it to register. So if you look at the track diagram that you have here, you see the car floats, you see the line going off to terminal stores, you see the New York Central line. That New York Central line that you see in this drawing did not exist until the High Line was built. Originally, the New York Central came down 11th Avenue, which is on the left. When they built the High Line, they needed to eliminate all the street running. And 11th Avenue was a commercial road, and 12th Avenue at this point, West Street, was not. So they moved everything over there. If you see pictures of the time, there's a lot of trucks parked. There's not a lot of traffic. It's not the high road, the highway that it is today. There's a lot of traffic on it today. But back when this was built, it was pretty much dead end at one point. I believe at 70th Street, 72nd Street. You couldn't go any further than that. Or actually, it might have been 59th Street. You couldn't go any further than that. So you'd come in here, and what's interesting, that runaround that's in the middle is 3 cars long. So it gives you an idea of the scale. So you could fit 3 cars in a locomotive. They would pull 3 cars in, run around them, and then start putting them into the tracks. They'd pull them out. This is one of those yards that when it's half full, it's full, because you need to have their maneuverability room to move cars around to get them on and off the car float. Here's a photograph from an Erie magazine of showing how the yard was. You see, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of an old building, and you see behind it, that's terminal stores. Then we're going to move to the Lehigh Valley's 27th Street. This was a little interesting to build because it required 2 slip switches. There's a slip switch above the D in West Yard and a slip switch to the left of the E in East Yard. If you take a line and draw it down the middle, it's literally east and west. The very top track here is where there was a crane. In the documentation that I found, there's 3 cranes in the building. I just haven't been able to find them all, but the one crane that I do know is right above the double crossover. And you'll see a series of tracks on the left that go into a platform. So that is where most of the LCL traffic was moved in and out of. On the 26th Street side, trucks would back up to that platform, and they'd be unloaded from the cars or loaded from the trucks to the railroad cars and vice versa. On the right-hand side where it says East Yard, those 3 tracks that are there were used primarily for offloading automobiles, automobile parts, and the 2 long tracks on the top right were used mostly as a team track for direct unloading to trucks. If you look very carefully, you'll see 3 boxes in the middle. Those were 3 freight elevators for 29-foot long trucks that would go up and down to every floor of the building. Quite incidentally, a friend of mine, Jeff Ward, worked in that building as a young man, and he was telling me he never got to see the railroad down there, but he has some very interesting stories. If you know Jeff, ask him about his stories about working at the Star at Lehigh. On the bottom right, I recently took a tour there. There's a hellacious, I would say, 8% grade that goes from 12th Avenue up to the 2nd floor above that yard. And it's very uncomfortable to walk. So I can imagine a fully loaded truck going up and down that. But it's about a 17-foot long, 17-foot tall door for the trucks to get in and out. So they'd go up to the 2nd floor, go into those elevators, go around and come into the building, drop shipments or pick up stuff. It's a very interesting setup. I had to curve the layout mostly because of safety. Originally, I had a boiler and wall that was on the opposite side of this. Since then, the wall came down and I could actually straighten it out. One of these years, I'll get around to it. It's perfectly fine, and everybody's used to it at this point. So I'm not sure if it would be something I'm going to put on the slate. But you see that bend down to the left. it was actually an S curve. So instead of bending down, it would actually straighten out, go straight off to the left and be parallel with the bottom number, which says 26. But that's the future. Just to show you the prototype here, you could see what I'm talking about here. This is an actual track map from the Lehigh Valley. This is what was there, what they were proposing on doing, removing tracks and adding stuff. This was proposed in 47, 48. So my layout's safe for this point, but you could see what they're going to be removing and all that. And it's kind of pleasing that I was working on hand-drawn images of the yard and those track maps that were drawn by the Port Authority, which word of warning, if you're using Sanborn maps or even Bromley maps, the drawings of the buildings, the tracks are just stuff that they note. So they may get the number of tracks or the arrangement wrong. They'll get where they generally are. So just keep that as a warning. This is actually was drawn by the company, the Lehigh Valley, so when they were doing this evaluation for modifications of the yard. So it really is fantastic when you get something right. All right. So one of the things about the layout is staging concerns. So we right now we have 3 different types of layouts. So the New York Central, the traffic flows north to south, railroad east and west, but it flows from 72nd Street to 30th Street and to St. John's Park Freight Terminal. So with that, we're going to use a conventional yard, conventional freight yard. With the Erie, the traffic flows east to west from New Jersey to New York City via car floats. So there's not going to be any type of real staging. There's not going to be like a staging track or anything like that. It's just going to be floats being moved around. My good friend Jim Dahlberg actually, to me, he's crazy. He actually picks up the car floats loaded with cars, walks around his room, puts them down. That's my nerves can't take that. So I just you'll see how I do it. But these are just staged individual car floats with their paperwork. Same thing for the Lehigh Valley. These are all done in a way so that the paperwork is done and then the cars are just put on the floats. So the space I had to work with is roughly 23 feet by 23, a little bit over 23 and a half. And there's a washer and dryer, there's a bathroom, there's a boiler, and there's a water heater. Since this was drawn, the wall on the top left was removed, which opens up the room a lot. And these are the original plans. The plan on the left is how the railroad was built originally. The plan on the right was the reconfiguration with the staging. The Highline staging sits above the staging for 30th Street Yard. It's a cool thing that my friend Phil Monette talked me into doing. Phil is an electrical lighting genius. He's a lighting engineer, and he's designed stuff for Broadway, for buildings, for layouts. And as a typical contractor, he said it would be done in a couple of weeks. It took 22 months. So just always keep in mind, add time for things that go wrong or changing the scope of the project and adding things to the project. So we were down for 22 months and then the pandemic hit. So here's a brief shot of the construction of the staging. Originally, you see where that building is on the top left. That is the height of the layout when everything got put back. So that's the second deck of staging. The first picture on the right is the first deck, and you can see how everything was done. Only I am crazy enough to hand lay code 83 turnouts in staging. So point of reference, when you do that, cut strain reliefs in for the hand laid. The track closest to you is one piece of rail that goes from that PC tie all the way over to the track number 1. And the very first hot humid day, track expanded, things were derailing. I had to go in there with with everything was put together with a saw and cut that track. Not fun, but the minute I cut it, everything went back into shape and we're fine. Here's a look at what everything looks like in staging. Now, you may want to ask, why am I ballasting in staging? I only ballast the first portion of staging, mostly because of the advice of Phil. This will keep everything stable. And after we did this, I wish I had ballasted the entire thing, because what happens is, with the heat and humidity and with the changing in temperature, which is actually not terrible down here, it's usually about 30 to 40% humidity. The track nails would have used in, because I did not want to use the glue, the caulking down here. So I used track nails mostly so we could align things and fix things as we were going on. One of the things I forgot is the coefficient of expansion of plastic is much different than the coefficient of expansion of metal. So as the metal expands, it moves slightly, and then the wood wants to eject the metal nail. So every now and then, I have to reach in there and just make sure that the nails are down. Wouldn't have happened had I if I just ballasted everything and then not worried about, and just use actual spikes. It's a little difficult to spike in the material we use. We use half inch birch plywood and 1/4 inch underlayment, which is the stuff you use to set tile in. The underlayment takes spikes really well, and it's the birch in it are compatible. Everything is glued, everything is nailed together, so nothing is moving on this, and it's been a dream once we got it in. And one of the decisions I made that I'm very happy with, except now I wish I would have put more in, is I put the strip LED lighting, because it helps to just see what's going on over there. So here's a look. It looks like a cutaway from the 1930s. On the top level this is a very early photograph. Top level is St. John's Park. The second level is the elevated staging. There's 8 tracks in there. And the bottom level is the 30th Street staging. There's only 7 tracks there. Mostly because I used the 2x4 to set and hold the trackage for the upper level. I wanted something sturdy that could be nailed down, screwed down, and not have to worry about it moving. And also, it's part of that gives the rigidity of that structure. Had I done it again, I would have probably used a thinner piece and put an 8th track down there. Really doesn't make a difference, because there's only 5 trains per session to go in anyway. And one of the lessons I learned from the original building of the layout is the more tracks you give people, the more they'll stuff them with stuff. So I remember earlier I said that the car floats are done in a specific manner, that they're in these staging boxes. So on the paperwork now, you see this is for the Lehigh Valley, this is identical to for the Erie. So we have 3 car floats staged for each op session. On the paperwork, it'll tell you what staging box it's in. It'll say staging box 1, staging box 2, and then there'll be one for the float. You work the float, you work the yards. Actually, it's a happy accident that's a ruler over this, so you get an idea what the scale is. Bittersweet story, those Erie switchers that you see there, Harold Worthwine had passed, and somebody thought that I would appreciate those switchers as a memento of his layout. I do, and I have them. Eventually, I'm going to have them all converted to DCC. They have rail links, and I'm going to have them running at 28th Street Yard as replacement engines. As you know, if you don't have a spare, you're going to need one. So always keep that in mind. So this is a view of an actual car float going into the Erie. What's interesting is if you look, you're looking straight at terminal stores. The Erie is off to the left. So they came in these curves, and they go into the yards. This is one that, again, it was from the 1950s. Forgot exactly where I found this photograph, but Philip Goldstein has it on his website now. I've had this for a few years. It hasn't been watermarked by anyone, but I believe it was out of an Erie employee magazine. What's interesting here is you can see the toggle bolts. The toggle bolts just align the tracks up and down so that they don't move. This is a Broadway float because, as you can see, the switch should be going off to another set of tracks, but there aren't any. So the Broadway floats had 2 tracks and this platform that ran down the middle. And you can see the winch that winches the car float in place, the hook that holds it in place. By the way, that's not enough structural strength to stop the car float from being shot into the harbor. If somebody got a little bit too aggressive, which happened with steam engine 135, and they bumped a little bit too hard, they would snap those ropes or snap off the hook and shoot the car float. It's happened. If you get Tom Flagg's book, New York Harbor in Color, you'll see a picture of a locomotive sitting in the water. So, all right, so I built the car floats. Again, when I started doing this, Walters decided to retire them. So over here you see me building the float bridge. This is the Erie float bridge. And if you go to Tam Valley, not to Tam Valley, if you go to Hanley Track, this is an unknown product that he has. It's basically that float bridge. It comes in 9 pieces, a lot easier to buy from him. You have to specifically request it. Gives you an idea what it looks like and all that. With the removal of a gas meter, I started putting in freight houses over 33rd Street. So this is a project that's currently underway. It's all built out of styrene. It's starting to go in. Remember earlier I said you're going to get a look at what it looks like from looking like the prototype that's entering the yard. Tracks to the left are coming in from the staging. Tracks to the right going to the freight house. I'm just going to have some pictures of running around the yard in here. That's the John T. Stanley Soap Company building. During an op session that's looking into the yard. This is from the freight house. Just give you guys an idea of what it looks like, everything here. That's where you see that bundle of wire and over there, that used to be a gas meter. So that's starting to be seen. That bundle of wire was behind a gas meter. There's going to be the future home of a very tall smokestack. For years, I had the platform, but no platform. So I was able to get some foam, paint it up, put it in there. Technical note, stay away from spray paints that are lacquer based because they will eat foam. Use the H2O based ones. Their covering is not that great, but if you sand it, you'll get a nice concrete look. That's the trackage there. This is the West Dock, which was this would have represented the original line going to 72nd Street, would have been street running. One of the interesting things I discovered in my track diagram and diving into the stuff that there was a West Virginia pulp and paper company building, so I modeled it. It's on the line going to 30th Street. Those are photographs of doors, and that's an actual decal that I made. So the photographs disappear. People think, and it's actually the whole building is less than an eighth of an inch thick. This is the stockyard, the slaughterhouse, the Budweiser plant, Anheuser-Busch. This is going across. That's an actual Indian motorcycle ad that I discovered over there, and that's the Spear building that's on the elevated. And then I started a war on the internet because the locomotives on the bottom, those are the RS1s that were painted. They're painted New York Central dark gray. They look black, correct? All 3 of those photographs are the same locomotives with different light. So they were never painted black until they were repainted in the late 40s, early 50s when they got their second paint scheme. They're actually that gray color, but you could see the same color in different lighting looks different. Car floats. This is heading into New Jersey. This is the float yards. I'm accelerating so we could get done on time. I started putting in the pavers. The next set of the project is putting in the Miller Expressway. This is a little bit better look of everything. And that building over there, that's terminal storage. That's a Photoshop image. And that's the Lehigh Starrett building. This is a look of how the track work is in there. You could see double slip at both ends. So that's one double slip, and at the other end is another double slip. upgrading and making it work. I started putting in tortoises in, so I needed a power supply. This is the coolest method. You just run one wire to the tortoise, one wire from the tortoise to the control panel, and by throwing the polarity, it reverses the switch. It's really cool. First, the big caveat on that is you need to get them in a home position, so whichever way there. There's plenty of articles on that. That's the panel we just built. Thanks to Phil Monat for helping me out with that. This is a panel coming out of staging. We're starting to remove the blue points and starting to put tortoises in. This is one of the things we're talking about the future. We're going to tortoisize the entire Erie also. We're trying to figure out how to do that with a panel. Paperwork, how to making it work. Unfortunately, the person who wrote this program is no longer with us, but this is a program we use to actually create the switch list on the left. So everything uses switch list. That's the Lehigh Valley and the Erie uses switch list. The New York Central uses these waybills. The waybills are designed to get the cars on and get them off. And all every siding, every spot has a slot for the waybills. You can see here, these are the ones for St. John's Park. I'm not St. John's, but Terminal Stores. And I just want to give a shout out to people who I would not have been able to get this layout built. Ron Parisi, who we lost, Harold Worthwine, Craig Biscayr, and Wayne Shortman. All these people contributed both intellectually and spiritually with the building of the layout. There's a lot of stuff from Harold layout that's on here, the tortoises at 30th Street. So I just want to give them a shout out. And of course, I lost my parents a few years ago, gone but not forgotten. With that, I want to say thank you and open it up for any questions. Sorry I went so fast there, but you got to keep on time.
You're fine. Let me go through the questions kind of in reverse order here.
Sure.
What's the name of the water company on the, oh, never mind. I think that's a joke. Let's see.
Okay, so there was an incident with water, and I think Ted DiOrio must be asking this question.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, he knows why it's called that. It's has to do with what you're not supposed to air and train the epoxy resin for the water, and so we had an in joke between all of us, and we call it Freeman's frothy water. So that's what it was called for. So if you mix up the I forgot what it's called, the water material that's epoxy based. That stuff actually never dries. It cures over 10, 15 years. They use it for bars. If you're going to mix it and you're going to use electric mixing, make sure you keep it submerged. If you bring it in and out, it actually puts bubbles in. And in order to get the bubbles out, you have to use a torch, which is not usually an issue unless you have a wooden pier.
Ooh, yeah. Wooden fire go. That's.
Yeah.
I had my firefighter training a number of years ago. I know that fire and wood are bad together.
That's especially little itty bitty wood that's dried out.
Yes. Let's see. There's somebody asking if you're planning to post YouTube videos of operations.
I've been doing it on my Facebook because it's a little easier. Facebook has been getting a little wonky lately. I was at Denville train station taking possession of 2 new steam engines, and I took a picture of a derail. And Facebook says it's a violent photograph.
Gosh. Well, it is.
No, but I will be posting again on on YouTube.
Let's see. Let's see. How tight are the curves in the yards?
30 inch. 30 inch. I think the narrowest one is about 28. The one going into the post office is 26 inch, and the narrowest and tightest one is the one between the Erie and Terminal Stores. That's roughly a 90-foot radius curve as the prototype had it.
Okay. The historic aerials image, which, by the way, I just got an ad on Facebook for historical aerials, so I think my computer is sniffing.
Yep.
Is paying attention to me. How much did it cost to purchase the image?
That image was $20.
Okay. Let's see. Trevor's asking, tell us about the change from blueprints to electric turnout control. Why change? Maintenance question?
What happens with the blue points over the years, I don't know if it's the plastic getting brittle or my users getting a little bit more ham-hocked. I had one guy snap a blue point off,
Ooh,
and what was left, the little tabs, if you're familiar with the blue points, that was left, the tabs were still attached to the under portion of the layout, but the blue point itself was dangling. The other issue I've been having with them is that as the people start pushing and pulling on the blue points, the little tabs start snapping off and they start breaking. That's my fault. That's not the manufacturer's fault. That's because I drilled them out. I've been putting clevises in on the replacement ones. And again, the problem with the clevises are if somebody pulls a little bit too hard, they pull the clevis out because the clevis will fail before the plastic does. And what's annoying about that is that usually where these guys are, it's not easy to get to. And actually, the tortoises made life a lot easier because it removes the some of these switches were 30 inches away, and then with the metal rods to get to them,
yeah.
it was just
Those metal,
a
I
nightmare.
mean, it's probably like what, piano wire or something.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, it's fine for short distances, but 30 inches, I mean, geez,
Yeah,
that's
it starts
just a
to, and
wobble.
this is the stuff, and it's all stainless steel wire that I bought.
Yeah,
That's for servos for model airplanes.
yeah, yeah. Yep. All right. Let's see. Um, Lots of compliments. Make sure you take a look at the chat. There was a, yeah, some people are being funny here. I did like the old helicopter shots there when you had the,
Yeah, the postcard. Yeah,
yep,
that was a fun find.
yep. Well, right now, that's all the questions for you.
Uh,
So,
can I ask a question?
sure.
In the real world, everything came in from a car float and went to the yards or the buildings and then went back out to a car float. So why does he need staging?
No, I just pre-staged the car floats so that instead of having to rewrite the bills, so what happens is that the car float itself in those staging boxes, that's just the next car float. So I don't have to do the work then and there, and I don't have to train somebody because unfortunately the gentleman who I had, the guys who I had who did the car floats on the fly, moved away, passed away, or are just not available as they were before. So all the car floats are pre-staged so that when they're done working a car float, I just take the cars off, take the box off, and then just put the new cars in. So it's to be more accurate, it's really a cassette staging.
Okay. If anybody else has questions, I've allowed you to unmute yourself. But otherwise we will, looks like people are dropping. So,
All right, thanks a lot.
Yeah, David, thanks so much for presenting. We appreciate it. Yeah, we're going to stop the recording.